Hi and welcome to my channel. This is a video looking at the risk of mid-air collision and near misses. It's primarily aimed at slower aircraft such as paramotors, sub-70, flex-wing microlight, anything up to around about 70 knots, but there are lessons for all aircraft. Okay, so let's start with a quick exercise. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a near miss with another aircraft, from initial sighting to nearly hitting it. So I'm guessing that the aircraft in your scenario was in front of you. I'm guessing it was probably flying faster than you, and I'm guessing that you probably had little time to react. So let's reassess these at the end of the video. So the case studies for this video came from the UK Airprox board. Looking at some figures from 2019, there were 4 Airproxes involving flex-wing aircraft. There were 5 involving paramotors. For every report that was filed for a near miss, there's probably 4 or 5 near misses that didn't have an Airprox report associated with them. This may be because pilots weren't aware of the near miss, or it might be that they didn't understand how to report. So let's set the scene by comparing what you see when you go flying with what somebody in a private pilot license style aircraft will see. So you've got a largely all-round unobstructed view. If you're flying a flex wing, you might have a little bit of metalwork in front of you, but there's very little to impinge on your view, and you're certainly able to look in the danger area, which is between these 2 red lines. Anything below that is likely to pass below you, and anything above that is likely to be passing above you. So between those 2 lines is the area you're likely to be focusing your attention. So if we compare your view with what you're likely to get in a PPL style aircraft, so this is a PA-28, which is one of the most common types of aircraft. You'll notice, first of all, there's an awful lot of metalwork around, which gives you a lot of blind spots. So there's quite a bit of the aircraft that you can't see through, obviously, and it relies on the pilot to move his head around to be able to see beyond it. You're looking through screens, they're frequently dirty and scratched, particularly on higher aircraft and the older aircraft. And you also get an awful lot of glare on the screens coming from the coaming, particularly in strong sunlight, and you can see that in this example here. For these scenarios, I've done some calculations based on the following assumptions. The assumption is that the aircraft that's trying to hit you is a light aircraft, so that's something like a PA-28 that we've just seen. It's flying along at 110 knots, which gives you 200 kilometers an hour. You're flying either a paramotor or a flex wing, flying at either 50 kilometers an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, which is a ballpark figure for those. But it just gives us an opportunity to develop some times based on distances and speeds to work out how much prior notice we should have before we hit another aircraft. Starting off with the head sector scenario, assuming you don't see the other aircraft and you're on a collision course, this is a table that shows you how long it will take to go from each of the ranges on the left-hand side to a collision point based on the 2 speeds, 50 kilometers an hour and 100 kilometers an hour. So in here, for example, if you were flying a paramotor at 50 kilometers an hour and you spotted the other aircraft at 2 kilometers away, it would take you 29 seconds to hit it. It would take you 24 seconds to hit it if you were flying a faster aircraft. So the thing to take away from the head sector is that flying a slow aircraft is actually working in your favor. It's giving you more time to see the aircraft directly ahead of you. And if you want to get an indication of what an aircraft looks like at 2 kilometers away, if you get a pen and draw a small blob on your thumbnail about 3 millimeters across and then hold that out at arm's length, that's the size of a PA-28 at 2 kilometers. So this is the first case study we're going to look at from one of the Airprox reports. This is a PA-28, which is flying at 110 knots, so that's 200 kilometers an hour. It has a near miss with a flex wing, which I'm estimating was flying at 70 kilometers an hour. That gives a closing speed of approximately 230 kilometers an hour. Bearing in mind that the angle between the 2 aircraft wasn't a head-on collision, it was slightly oblique and off to one side. So the PA-28 saw the flex wing at 7 seconds, so that's around about 450 meters. And the flex wing pilot remained untraced, so he was either not bothered by the near miss and therefore didn't bother to report it, or completely unaware, and he appeared to take no evasive action at all throughout. So this is the scene 7 seconds before the near point of the near miss. You can see the view out the front of the aircraft. The flex wing aircraft is somewhere in that red circle, and then you've got the 2 lines that we indicated earlier on showing you the danger zone of where something that's likely to hit you is most likely to be coming from. We've already had a look at this picture and remind you of the obstruction. So with the pilot being on the left-hand side of the aircraft, I'm not entirely sure that he's going to have a particularly good or clear view of the flex wing coming from that direction. And in fact, it was only the passenger in the right-hand seat that saw the other aircraft that called the pilot to take evasive action. I'll put a link in the description to the original video of this, but you'll see that the chance of collision was very high. The PA-28 pilot took evasive action at the last moment, and the board determined that this marginally increased the separation range between the two aircraft. I don't think he would have hit it. I think he would have passed underneath it, but I think it would have been very close, and certainly a lot closer than anyone would want it to be. So assuming again that you're in the microlight aircraft or you're in the paramotor aircraft and you're flying against a PPL style aircraft, we can now work out some separation distances if you did see the other aircraft at different ranges. I've put in a reaction time to these as well. So for the shorter range pickups, it's around about a 5-second action time. So that's the time it takes to see the aircraft and to execute a 90-degree turn, and 15 seconds for the longer ranges. So again, with pickup distances down the left-hand side, and then in brackets, you've got the action time that I've allocated to each one. And then with different speeds for a paramotor and for a flex wing, you'll see again, if you spotted an aircraft at 2 kilometers away, in a paramotor, you'd have about 370 meters of separation before it flew behind you. And in a flex wing, you could generate 600 meters. So the big takeaway from this is that the faster the aircraft in this scenario, the better, because you can generate a greater separation distance. It's important to see just how much separation you can generate even with a relatively late pickup. So at 2 kilometers, you're still able to generate 370 meters of separation from the other aircraft. And I'd also argue that by turning, you're more likely to be seen by him as well, because you are changing your position relative to him in the screen. And also you're presenting a different aspect of your wing. So as your wing's turning, you're also presenting him with something that's changing in his field of view as well. So that's the common scenario, the one that we all think of. In fact, there are two much more dangerous ones. One is with the aircraft directly behind you, and one's with the aircraft coming from the side. And I'll show you the reason why for that now. And because you're traveling slowly, it means that any aircraft that's traveling faster than you can hit you from any direction. And flying the aircraft that you do, most other aircraft fly faster than you do. And so looking at the scenario here, it's obvious that the light aircraft is going to very easily be able to chase down the paramotor and hit it from behind, whereas it's much more difficult for it to chase down and hit another aircraft of a similar speed. So looking at this quite extreme case then, which was an Airprox from 2019, this is a Tornado GR4 flying at 400 knots, so 740 kilometers an hour, and a paramotor flying at 26 knots. So the Tornado passed the paramotor from behind, and the paramotor wasn't seen by the Tornado until it passed down the side of it. And the paramotor obviously didn't see the Tornado until it had passed him. With the closing speed between these two aircraft, if it had seen him at 5 kilometers away, he'd have had 26 seconds to respond. So that's roughly 5 seconds per kilometer would be his response time had he seen the paramotor, but he didn't. And bearing in mind the Tornado's got 2 people in it, you've got 2 sets of eyes in the aircraft, but there's obviously a lot going on in a military fast jet, and the view from the front of a Tornado isn't actually that good either. They're no longer in service, but a lot of aircraft don't necessarily have a particularly good view out the front. So for me, there are 2 really big learning points from this. The first is faster is better, but obviously whether you're flying a flex wing or a paramotor, you're never going to be able to outrun a Tornado. The second is that if you're not looking behind you and the aircraft behind you doesn't see you, it's got a very good chance of hitting you. Not being able to see the aircraft that's hunting you down from behind and might hit you is a huge disadvantage. So one of the big things I've taken away from this is a requirement to turn regularly so that I can see the airspace behind me. It just makes sure that there's nothing sneaking up from behind. So the next scenario is similar but slightly different. So this is where you've got an aircraft which is out to your left or right hand side around about 90 degrees. Now certainly from my paramotor flying experience, although I can look out to 90 degrees either side, I've noticed that I rarely do. And it's something I should do more of. So assuming here that the pink line gives you an indication of the edges of your observation, you're going to be spending most of your time looking forward. So the thing you'll notice is that as this is a collision, the aircraft on the right stays in exactly the same position relative to the aircraft on the left. And it's also worth bearing in mind the fact that the pilot in this aircraft on the left-hand side with a lot of blanking in the cockpit may not be aware that you're off to his left-hand side and may not even be able to see you. So in this scenario, it doesn't really matter if you're fast or slow. The fact that you've got blanking in his cockpit and you're not going to be looking in that direction doesn't really make that much difference. This really is a case of luck whether the other aircraft sees you or whether you happen to see the other aircraft or not. So in the final case study from an Airprox report, this is an SR-20, which is a higher performance PPL type aircraft, and it spotted the paramotor at 300 meters just off to the right hand side. Had it been to the left, I don't know if it would have necessarily seen it. It spotted the aircraft 4 seconds before collision, and then the SR-20 bunted to fly below the paramotor. Again, the paramotor pilot was untraced, so presumably was unaware that this had even happened. So what did I learn when I was looking through the Airprox reports and making this video? Well, firstly, most light aviation flies at around about 1,000 to 2,500 feet, and I would argue that that includes most paramotors and most microlights and slow aircraft as well. I also learned that lookout is rarely disciplined. So although people do look out, and that's obviously what we do when we go flying, it's not really done in a disciplined fashion. People tend to fly around and just look out. And when they do look out, particularly in a PPL type aircraft, that's affected by the sun, by glare, by the screens, distractions and blind spots within the aircraft as well. So the thing I've taken away is to make sure that I do a better lookout in the future, particularly if I've got any blind spots, which for me is everywhere behind me. And then finally, that slow aircraft are vulnerable to attack from all around. If you're flying along in a fast aircraft, you've got very little that can hit you from behind. If you're in a slow aircraft, everything can hit you from behind. So going back to our little exercise at the start, I guess that you assume that the other aircraft is likely to be in front of you. That's just based on, as we've said before, based on the expectation that that's where the traffic's coming from, because that's where you normally look. And if you do see another aircraft, that's normally where it is. We've seen from this that it might not. The other aircraft was probably flying faster than you. You're in a slow airplane. That's a matter of fact. And you probably had little time to react. Well, that's an interesting one. If you get a late spot on the other aircraft, you do have little time to react. But as you'll have seen from the table that I put up earlier, if you can see something at 2 to 3 kilometers away, you've got sufficient time to react and to get out of its way. The difficulty comes in being able to look around effectively 360 degrees to see the other aircraft. In other faster aircraft, you don't have to look through that 360 degrees. In a very slow aircraft like this, you do. So based on this video, these are my top tips. First of all, have a disciplined lookout. Make sure you know why you're looking out, where you're looking out, and look in the right place at the right time. Looking behind you occasionally if you need to by turning your aircraft to be able to see behind you. Now, I regularly fly very long cross-country legs, sometimes 60 or 70 kilometers at a time, so that's over an hour. And it's only recently I've realized that I might fly for that long without ever turning to look behind me. It's only since making this video I realized that that's where a lot of the risk is, but I've never looked in that direction because I didn't realize it until now. Another way of easily spotting other aircraft is to try to look for their shadows. So you might not be able to see them in the danger zone, but you might be able to see their shadow on the ground. Be aware if you're flying towards a low sun. So if you're flying towards a low sun, the aircraft that's behind you is also flying towards a low sun, and he is suffering from the glare that we described before as a result of looking at the low sun. So he's likely to see you very late. If you turn back towards him and you've got the sun directly on him, you'll see him at a much greater distance than he's going to see you. Be aware of taking your own distractions flying, which are going to impinge on your ability and your desire to look out. I've been there several times of mucking about with my phone when I should be looking out. It's human nature, but it's something that's very easy to get round if you discipline yourself to making sure that you spend less time looking at your GoPro and your phone and more time looking for other traffic. You should put time and effort into understanding where your local hotspots are. In my next video, I'll show you a way of being able to do that. And then finally, in terms of the rules of the air work if both aircraft see each other and they have that common understanding of what they need to do to avoid a collision. In 2 of the examples in the scenarios that we've given, only one aircraft saw the other one and it was too late to really apply the rules of the air. And in the other one, the aircraft didn't see each other at all until it would have been a collision had there not been luck involved. Don't assume because you've seen another aircraft, it's going to turn to avoid you. I make the assumption now that the other aircraft hasn't seen me, and then I turn to break the collision regardless of who is in the right. So I hope you found the video interesting. There's a link to all of the information in the comments, so feel free to go off and look at any of the videos or any of the Airprox reports. There's also a link to the UK Airprox website, which will allow you to look at different scenarios and to see if you can pull out any different lessons to me. There are quite a few on there relating to slower aircraft, and that seems to be an increasingly common feature. And then finally, a plug for my next video, where I'm going to be investigating using an ADS-B app to find other aircraft and to alert you when it's getting close.